Earth. Home. Of all the planets NASA has explored, none have matched the dynamic complexity of our own. Deserts, tropical forests, icy poles, massive storms rage over land and oceans. A unique atmosphere protects and insulates us. Liquid water spans its vast surface, and a delicate balance of systems gives way to a kaleidoscope of life. Earth is a very special place. From the vantage point of space, the perspective of sky and sea, and all across the land, we study our planet not only to learn about it, but also to protect it.
Solar energy, it is extremely important because we have to protect our environment. This means a lot for the future of solar energy, and the installation of this solar trees, particularly in this park, you see, is the beginning of installation of other solar trees in other parks in the city of Miami.
Earth is my favorite planet.
My favorite part about planet Earth is the ocean.
So my favorite part about Earth is there's life here. We know that there is life here. There's so many aspects of it. I mean, the very fact that we're here.
My favorite part about the Earth is the Arctic.
That feeling before a thunderstorm.
I enjoy the feel of the wind.
When you fly, when you are on an airplane, and you are in between two decks of clouds.
There are so many different environments on Earth that we are just now exploring in the past few decades.
It actually floors me that we have such a large area on this planet that is, basically relatively unexplored.
The depths of the ocean.
To see that life flourishing under the water.
I think that's fantastic.
I feel like the best thing about planet Earth is that it's so close to the moon, and the moon is awesome.
That the Earth has a large moon that keeps its climate stable by keeping its poles stable.
Coming back up to where does our atmosphere end?
The feedback between life and our climate.
How far out can microbes live?
I like how sunlight interacts with Earth.
How that influences the sea ice.
I just love the diversity of life on Earth and all of the places that it can thrive. It's pretty amazing.
Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? We're going to answer that question. This is a condensed answer. To dive more deeply, we invite you to view the article on our website, gotquestions.org. We live in a world of pain and suffering. There is no one who is not affected by the harsh realities of life. And the question, why do bad things happen to good people, is one of the most difficult questions in all of theology. God is sovereign, so all that happens must have at least been allowed by Him, if not directly caused by Him. At the outset, we must acknowledge that human beings, who are not eternal, infinite, or omniscient, cannot expect to fully understand God's purposes and ways. The book of Job deals with the issue of why God allows bad things to happen to good people. Job was a righteous man, yet he suffered in ways that are almost beyond belief. God allowed Satan to do everything he wanted to Job, except kill him, and Satan did his worst. What was Job's reaction? Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job did not understand why God had allowed the things he did, but he knew God was good and therefore continued to trust in him. Ultimately, that should be our reaction as well. As hard as it is to acknowledge, we must remember that there are no good people. All of us are tainted and infected with sin. As Jesus said, no one is good except God alone. We live in a fallen world, and we experience the effects of the fall. One of those effects is injustice and seemingly senseless suffering. When wondering why God would allow bad things to happen to good people, it's also good to consider these 4 things about the bad things that happen. Number 1, bad things happen to good people in this world, but this world is not the end. Christians have an eternal perspective. We will have a reward someday, and it will be glorious. Number 2, bad things happen to good people, but God uses those bad things for an ultimate, lasting good. When Joseph, innocent of wrongdoing, finally came through his horrific sufferings, he was able to see God's good plan in it all. Number 3, bad things happen to good people, but those bad things equip believers for deeper ministry. Those with battle scars can better help those going through the battles. And number 4, bad things happen to good people, and the worst things happened to the best person. Jesus was the only truly righteous one, yet he suffered more than we can imagine. Jesus is no stranger to our pain. God allows things to happen for a reason. Whether or not we understand his reasons, we must remember that God is good, just, loving, and merciful. Often, bad things happen to us that we simply cannot understand. Instead of doubting God's goodness, we should trust him. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. We walk by faith, not by sight. That answers the question, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Research this question further on our website, gotquestions.org. Give a thumbs up and be sure to click subscribe. Meanwhile, if you'd like to study more, click the bell and check out these other questions.
All engine running.
50 years ago, we pioneered a path to the moon. The trail we blazed cut through the fictions of science and showed us all what was possible.
It's very pretty out here.
Today, our calling to explore is even greater. To go farther, we must be able to sustain missions of greater distance and duration. We must use the resources we find at our destinations. We must overcome radiation, isolation, gravity, and extreme environments like never before. These are the challenges we face to push the bounds of humanity. We're going to the moon to stay by 2024, and this is how.
This all starts with the ability to get larger, heavier payloads off-planet and beyond Earth's gravity.
For this, we designed an entirely new rocket.
The Space Launch System. SLS will be the most powerful rocket ever developed.
And with components in production
and more in testing,
this system is capable of being the catalyst for deep space missions.
We need a capsule
that can support humans from launch
through deep space and return safely back to Earth.
For this, we've built Orion.
This is NASA's next generation human space capsule.
Using data from lunar orbiters that continue to reveal the moon's hazards and resources.
We're currently developing an entirely new approach to landing and operating on the moon.
Using our commercial partners to deliver science instruments and robotics to the surface, we are paving the way for human missions in 2024.
Our charge is to go quickly and to stay, to press our collective efforts forward with a fervor that will see us return to the moon in a manner that is wholly different than 50 years ago.
We want lunar landers that are reusable,
that can land anywhere on the lunar surface. The simplest way to do so is to give them a platform in orbit around the moon from which to transition.
An orbiting platform to host deep space experiments and be a waypoint for human capsules. We call this lunar outpost Gateway.
The beauty of the Gateway is that it can be moved between orbits.
It will balance between the Earth and Moon's gravity,
in a position that is ideal for launching even deeper space missions.
In 2009, we learned that the moon contains millions of tons of water ice.
This ice can be extracted and purified for water. It can be separated in oxygen for breathing or hydrogen for rocket fuel.
The moon is quite uniquely suited
to prepare us and propel us to Mars and beyond.
This is what we are building.
This is what we're training for.
This we can replicate throughout the solar system.
This is the next chapter of human space exploration.
Humans are the most fragile element of this entire endeavor, and yet we go for humanity. We go to the moon and on to Mars to seek knowledge and understanding and to share it with all. We go knowing our efforts will create opportunities that cannot be foreseen. We go because we are destined to explore and see it with our own eyes. We turn towards the moon now, not as a conclusion, but as preparation, as a checkpoint toward all that lies beyond. Our greatest adventures remain ahead of us. We are going.
We're going.
We are going.
We are going.
We're going.
Good evening. Hello. I'm Don Smurgan. And I'm Justin Briley. Breaking news. It's been reported that the Christian faith is about to go extinct as people reject religion for the brave new world of atheism.
Actually, that's not true. Christianity is growing faster across the world than at any time in history. And while there has been growth among non-religious in the West, research shows that it's actually atheism that is shrinking as a proportion of the global population.
Well, this just in. Science has finally disproved God. The news was confirmed by astronomers who, despite searching with their most powerful telescopes, have not been able to find a bearded old man in the sky.
Seriously? I mean, maybe telescopes aren't the right tool to be searching for God. In any case, modern cosmological discoveries such as the Big Bang, fine-tuning, the mathematical nature of the universe have actually opened up the God question, not shut it down.
Okay, mister. This ought to do it. Online sources have confirmed tonight that Jesus never existed. The news, which has rocked the world of faithful believers.
Hang on, that's just silly. Where did you get that from?
Websites.
Right. Look, there are barely any scholars in the relevant fields who doubt the existence of Jesus. On the contrary, research has given us more evidence than we've ever had for his life, death, and arguably his resurrection. Well, take it from Don. Fake news is everywhere these days, but here's a true fact. Nearly half of Christians never share their faith with others, either because they lack confidence or they think it's wrong to even claim to have the truth in today's world. In a world of fake news, it's time to find our Christian confidence again. Join me, Justin Briley, at this year's Unbelievable Conference, along with Krish Kandaya, Christy Mayer, Bruxy Cavey, Ruth Jackson, Craig Hazen, and many more international speakers. Join the revolution in London on Saturday, the 20th of July, and speak truth in a post-truth world.
Can we know with a reasonable degree of confidence what the original manuscript said?
This commitment might cost them their life.
I have discovered that there is so much more out there that I never knew about, that most pastors, even most apologists, are unaware of the real scope and strength of this evidence.
Well, what does it look like to be carried along or moved by the Holy Spirit?
So how does the evidence for Christianity compare to the evidence for other religions?
If there's one thing we ought to get right, it's the reasons that we believe what we believe.
There was something different there.
So what do you personally find to be the most compelling evidence that Jesus was who he said he was?
They had experiences they were persuaded were appearances of the risen Jesus to them, and that it transformed their lives.
This is what the claim is. It's a hard thing to get wrong.
The people who ought to be offended by Christians if we were faithful to Jesus' teaching today are the white supremacists, are the Ku Klux Klan, are the ultra-nationalists, not the people who are on the margins of our society. They were the ones Jesus hung out with and loved.
August 15th, 1945. Throngs of Americans are rushing city streets to celebrate good news. With the last of the Nazi threat beaten at Berlin a few months earlier, Americans had just gotten news that their final major enemy, Japan, would surrender. And with President Truman's announcement accepting it, the planet's deadliest war had just stopped.
But believe me, the celebration that is going on dwarfs any New Year's Eve, surging, teeming, screaming, joyous humanity. We've never seen anything like it in
The United
our
States
career.
has seen plenty of wars since World War II, but none of them have ended with celebrations like these. That's partly due to the fact that few, if any, wars since then have been clear American victories. But mostly it's because, these days, our wars don't end at all.
We will bring an end to
After
this war.
17 years of fighting,
You can take that to the
the
bank.
U.S. is still at war.
There's nothing wrong with open-ended troop deployments.
We will accept no outcome but victory.
American leadership is not just respected, it is required.
To better understand the American Forever War, we need to go back to the founding.
If you look at the way that the founders talked about war and permanent military establishments, they were quite adamant on this point. If the federal government was allowed to have a standing permanent army, that it would be a threat. The First Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence both spoke of standing armies being one of the reasons for wanting to separate from England in the first place.
This skepticism toward a permanent wartime posture mostly held for much of America's early history. Wars ended decisively, and servicemen and women went back into the labor force. And then things changed.
Americans were accustomed to living a relatively safe and secure existence, and suddenly they felt very vulnerable.
Now, we must be ready for a new danger, the atomic bomb.
Worried about what this new American fear might license, President Dwight Eisenhower gave a now prophetic speech.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
By 1961, Eisenhower had seen the Cold War last over a decade. The length of the war was producing a permanent standing army just as the founders had feared, giving rise to a military-industrial complex made up of three key groups that face strong incentives to keep America at war.
The first is a small number of American companies that depend heavily upon the manufacture of military implements.
These arms manufacturers are just like any other private company and want to see increased profits that they can only get from a nation at war.
The second is Congress.
Congressional candidates want to win elections, and to do that they need money and support, which they can get in part from large and growing constituencies employed by the defense industry.
And the third is the bureaucracy.
The defense bureaucracy is just like any other bureaucracy. It wants to see its budgets and prestige grow, and wars can give them that. Eisenhower's fear was that a protracted wartime footing would cultivate these three groups' dependence on war, and in turn encourage their support for war.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
There was a CNN article. The headline was, "Army to Congress, thanks, but no tanks."
The Pentagon doesn't want it, the soldiers don't need it. But Congress will give it to them anyway.
Row upon row of M1 Abrams tanks. You, the taxpayer, are still likely to be on the hook.
General Odierno, Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, testified before Congress that we don't need these tanks. He's fairly explicit on this point, and effectively Congress just said, yeah, we understand what you just said, we don't agree, and we're going to buy them anyway.
Is it national security, or is it congressional job security?
This kind of careless spending is pretty common, but it wasn't even the most worrying prospect of the military-industrial complex. The founders had deliberately set up our government to make the decision to go to war a difficult one, forcing public debate about whether or not the war effort was worth making.
When the United States didn't have a permanent armaments industry, every single time you had to go to war, the American people had to be convinced that the war was worth fighting. But by the 1960s, that military establishment existed. The president didn't actually have to make the case, it was already there.
Tonight, the battle has been joined. Leave Kuwait or be driven
Today,
out.
our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against...
By the early 90s, the Cold War had finally ended, and the US no longer needed its vast military to fight off the Soviet threat. So with the war over, you would think that America's military would come to look more like one at peacetime. But that's not what happened.
When the Cold War ended, why did the U.S. military remain as active as it did? Why was it in so many places?
800 American military bases in more than 70 countries.
Post-Cold War activity showed Americans that the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about was here to stay, whether or not we had a major enemy to warrant it.
I think it was reasonable for Americans to think that military spending would go down quite dramatically. And again, in some respects it did, but not nearly as what you might expect. The military establishment had in fact become permanent.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes in Afghanistan.
War has come to Iraq for the third time in a quarter of a century.
We're going to war with Iraq. Why? I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail.
After the 9/11 attacks thrust America into the war on terror, spending soared, and as objectives shifted from limited missions to nation building, spending reached a high not seen since World War II, and Americans were fed promise after promise that this would not be the new normal.
We are leaving in 2014, period.
And by the end of next year, our war in Afghanistan will be over.
The president will soon announce a major shift. Fewer troops will be coming home from Afghanistan than originally planned.
Great nations do not fight endless wars.
But you want to keep troops there now.
When it was chosen, well, we spent a fortune on building this incredible base. We might as well keep it.
The sway of the military-industrial complex on American foreign policy may leave the prospect of peace feeling elusive. But there is hope.
I'm hopeful for the future of American foreign policy because I do see an entire generation of Americans who have grown up and reached adulthood during the time of the post-9/11 wars, who are committed to principles of tolerance and trade and cultural exchange, but deeply skeptical of the military as a preferred instrument of American foreign policy.
This is one of those times in the affairs of nations when the gravest choices must be made if there is to be a turning toward a just and lasting peace.
You know, it's funny, sometimes American journalists talk about how bad a country is because people are lining up for food. That's a good thing. In other countries, people don't line up for food. The rich get the food and the poor starve to death.
The distribution of wealth in this country is one of the most unfair and distorted in the entire world. I think you change it through tax laws. I think you change it through public ownership of significant parts of the economy.
Everybody was totally convinced that Castro was the worst guy in the world. They forgot that he educated their kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society.
Throughout his career, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders has explained away the inevitable downsides of massively increasing the power of the state over the individual.
It's a dictatorship, it's a poor economy, we want changes. But have some good things been done in Cuba? Yes.
Sanders once identified as a radical socialist who admired the achievements of Cuba under Fidel, of Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, and of the Soviet Union right up to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Their public transportation system was the cleanest, most effective mass transit system that I've ever seen in my life. The stations themselves were absolutely beautiful, including many works of art, chandeliers that were beautiful.
Running for office in Vermont in the 70s, Sanders sought a top tax rate of 100%, saying nobody should earn more than $1 million. Sanders wanted to stop businesses from moving out of their original communities, saying the ultimate solution to protect workers was national legislation that would bring about the public ownership of the major means of production. He favored the public ownership of utilities, banks, and major industries, without compensation to investors or stockholders.
Face it, you don't find too many socialists in elective office in this country, and one is elected mayor of a sizable city, well, that's news.
Shortly after he was elected mayor of Burlington, Vermont in 1981, Sanders told a room full of charity workers, "I don't believe in charities, because only the government should provide social services to the needy."
Do I believe that the profit motive is fundamental to human nature? The answer is no. I think the spirit of cooperation, that you and I can work together better rather than having to compete against each other and destroy each other.
Healthcare is a right.
Today, Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist and has himself become a millionaire.
I wrote a best-selling book. If you write a best-selling book, you can be a millionaire too.
He favors single-payer healthcare, free public college for all, and a $15 minimum wage.
We're not talking about Venezuela. We're not talking about Cuba. So the next time that you hear me attacked as a socialist, remember this. I don't believe government should take over, the grocery store down the street or own the means of production.
But one thing has remained constant as Sanders has shifted his model for US policy from Nicaragua, Cuba, and the USSR to Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. In all of these countries, he's misled his followers about what's really happening.
As a socialist, the word socialism does not frighten me, and I think it's probably fair to say that the Nicaraguan government is primarily a socialist government. The government there has the strange and unusual idea that they should attempt to do something for the people of Nicaragua rather than for the United States corporations. They are now teaching poetry not only to peasants and to workers, but in the military, in the police department.
When Sanders was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, he vowed that his city would defy the Reagan administration's embargo against Nicaragua and the Sandinistas, who had overthrown an American-backed dictator and instituted a revolutionary socialist government. In 1985, Sanders traveled to Nicaragua to attend a celebration in honor of the revolution's 6th anniversary.
I mean, it's unbelievable to say that a mayor of a city of 38,000 is now the highest-ranking American to visit them during the celebration of their revolution. I was treated, in a special way.
Surrounded by reporters at the airport upon his return, Sanders was enthusiastic about what he had seen in Nicaragua.
Many of the things that we saw were impressive. There's a tremendous sense of energy.
Sanders praised the Sandinista leadership and President Daniel Ortega.
Ortega is an impressive guy. Ernesto Cardenal is a funny-looking guy. He's gray hair. And he really does remind you of a hippie. They are not, to quote Ronald Reagan, Looney Tune characters. So I just went all around and stopped people and you ask them, are you with the government or not? They kind of laugh. They don't quite understand what you're talking about. Of course they're with the government. Now, obviously, I will be attacked by every editorial writer in the Free Press for being a dumb dupe. Maybe I am. I was impressed by their intelligence and by their sincerity. These are not political hacks.
He praised the seizure of private farms and businesses.
In terms of land reform, giving, for the first time in their lives, real land to farmers. And people of Nicaragua, the poor people, respect that. Rich people, needless to say, who used to have the good life there, are not terribly happy.
What Sanders didn't mention was that by 1985, international watchdog groups had exposed the Sandinistas' significant human rights violations. A 1981 report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights revealed mass executions and persecution of indigenous peoples. And just 2 years before Sanders made his trip, Time magazine reported that hundreds of citizens were disappearing every month at the hands of the Sandinistas.
Many of us get depressed about what's going on in Nicaragua today and the absolute lies that are coming out of the White House. In fact, we have a right to be very exhilarated.
Sanders accused the American government and media of conspiring to cover up a socialist success story.
The important story is not Nicaragua. When you read the New York Times, the real truth is not being told and how that's obfuscated. Okay, that's what the interesting story. If you get on the air and you say, I'm sympathetic to the Sandinista government. I think it was right they made their revolution. They're trying to do the right thing. No good. My point to Ortega is they are not getting their message of what they are trying to do out to the American people.
You're being completely uncritical. Is there anything at all that you would trade?
That's enough for tonight. I just came back from a 14-hour trip, so
The Sandinistas would remain in power for 5 more years after Sanders' visit, and the Nicaraguan Permanent Commission on Human Rights would go on to document over 14,000 instances of rape, torture, and murder during their reign.
They really were talking about a transformation of society, giving power to the poor people, to the working people. And that has caused a conflict, needless to say, in Nicaragua, which we're seeing today. I remember, for some reason, I was being very excited when Fidel Castro made the revolution in Cuba. I was a kid and I remember reading that. And it just seemed right and appropriate that poor people were rising up against rather ugly rich people.
While Sanders was still mayor of Burlington, he traveled to Cuba in 1989 to seek a meeting with Fidel Castro, though he ended up settling for the mayor of Havana. By this time, Castro had seized private farms and businesses, imprisoned artists, created informant squads to monitor and arrest dissenters, and forced gay citizens and other undesirables into labor camps.
Everybody was totally convinced that Castro was the worst guy in the world, that all the Cuban people were going to rise up in rebellion against Fidel Castro. They had forgot that he educated their kids, gave them health care, totally transformed the society. Not to say that Fidel Castro or Cuba are perfect, they are certainly not.
Castro was open about his need to limit individual rights in order to ensure collective rights. He understood that curbing press freedoms was a prerequisite for the success of a socialist government, saying he couldn't tolerate dissidents in the mass media because the people's cohesion is fundamental.
If you ask us if a paper could appear here against socialism, I could say honestly, no, it cannot appear. In that sense, we do not have the freedom of the press that you possess in the U.S.
But Sanders disagreed with Castro. He thought the American press was similarly compromised because it was controlled by politicians and big money interests.
Beginning to read about the Cuban Revolution, and what I was more impressed about is how it was being reported in the United States press. And I began to understand that you don't always hear all of the truth.
For example, just last night I was watching Canadian television, which we get down here. There was a program on Cuba. We're not allowed to see those programs here in the United States.
Just because Ronald Reagan dislikes these people does not mean to say that the people in their own nations feel the same way.
Today, the Cuban government censors the internet, bans public displays of affection between gay couples, and jails people for criticizing the government.
You could say there's some positive things in Cuba, some very negative things. 50 years after the revolution, people still can't dissent with freedom. The economy is terrible. But, it's somehow they've decided that Cuba is the only non-democratic country in the world.
Glory to the great Soviet people, the builders of communism.
The problem with the word socialism is that very often it's been equated with what happens in the Soviet Union, which is authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I believe very strongly in the right of dissent.
Sanders traveled to the Soviet Union in 1988, 3 years before its collapse. He had gotten married to his second wife, Jane, the day before leaving, and the trip doubled as what he called, quote, a very strange honeymoon. Sanders formalized Burlington's relationship with its Russian sister city, Yaroslavl, and praised the communist government's social and cultural achievements.
We went to a theater in Yaroslavl, which was absolutely beautiful, had 3 separate stages, including a puppeteer area, and the cost, the highest price of a ticket that you can get, was the equivalent of $1.50.
En route home, a journalist confronted him again at the airport with reporting by the Associated Press of dilapidated, unsanitary living conditions and food shortages in Yaroslavl.
That there was no hot water and no food. I can't, none of us did an exhaustive study of living conditions in Yaroslavl. I didn't notice much deprivation. Howard, is that a fair statement? Yeah.
Later, he said he was impressed by Soviet officials' transparency in acknowledging their housing crisis, which he found comparable to America's.
We have a major housing crisis, which they acknowledge. But they acknowledge that not only do they not have enough housing, but the construction and the quality of their housing is also not adequate. And they were very free to mention that.
But one can't isolate a situation and say, look, socialism has failed over there compared to what? Do you know that in the United States of America today, the average married couple can no longer afford a home?
Sanders also appreciated the Soviets' openness about other issues and believed policymakers in the U.S. had much to learn from the communist system.
They are absolutely open in acknowledging that they are not a democratic society.
Their healthcare system is free, but they would be open to acknowledge that it is probably 10 years behind the United States in terms of medical technology.
We were willing to be critical of the United States. We were there to say, yeah, we have problems, you have problems. There are strengths to your system, there are strengths to our system. Our goal was, let's take the strengths of both systems.
This land was made for you and me.
What I believe in has nothing to do with communism.
After a failed run for governor of Vermont in 1986, around the fall of the Soviet Union, Sanders set his sights on higher office.
We freed the slaves a long, long time ago, but in many respects, the average working person today has very little rights.
He rebranded himself a democratic socialist and won a seat in Congress in 1990.
Authoritarian communism has been a vicious political system which, over its length of time, has resulted in the murder of many, many millions of people. As an economic system, it has not succeeded, and I'm delighted to see its demise. That has nothing to do with democratic socialism.
Today, Sanders objects to comparisons between his policies and those of the Sandinistas or Castros.
When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela, I'm not looking at Cuba, I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden.
What hasn't changed is Sanders' unwillingness to acknowledge the political and economic realities of the countries he points to as models. Scandinavia is a bastion of free market capitalism. In the Libertarian Fraser Institute's 2018 Human Freedom Index, Norway, Denmark, and Finland ranked higher than the United States. And in 2015, the Danish Prime Minister directly contradicted Sanders' claims.
I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. It might surprise some of you, but Forbes last year named Denmark the best country in the world for business.
Denmark does offer expansive social benefits, including single-payer healthcare, free education, and months of paid family leave.
What is the catch, you could ask? And the most obvious one is, of course, the high taxes. The top income tax in Denmark is almost 60%.
When you think about 90%, you don't think that's obviously too high?
No.
Danish citizens also pay a 25% sales tax and excise taxes on cars of up to 180%. But tax revenue in Nordic countries isn't enough to pay for their social programs, which are unsustainable in their current form.
We have no choice but to reform our society in order to preserve the welfare state and the public support for it.
Sweden is raising its retirement age and further privatizing parts of its healthcare system. In Finland, the coalition government recently resigned after it failed to pass reforms it viewed as crucial to averting financial ruin. Denmark is increasing its retirement age to 73 and cutting spending and taxes.
The answer cannot always be send more money. I want to improve our competitiveness, reduce taxes for business, remove red tape.
Sanders also points to Norway as a model, a country where massive oil production subsidizes the welfare benefits of a population that's roughly 62 times smaller than in the US. He never acknowledges fundamental differences between the Nordic countries and America or the true costs of the policies he champions. Sanders wants to offer even more generous benefits than those in Scandinavia and thinks that the wealthiest taxpayers can simply foot the bill.
So you're saying we can pay for all this without raising taxes on anybody but the 1%?
May have to go down a little bit lower than that, but not much lower.
Sanders has proposed a government takeover of the healthcare sector, or about 18% of GDP, at a cost of $32 trillion over 10 years. He wants to increase Social Security benefits, offer free public college, and grant the state sweeping new powers to tackle climate change through the Green New Deal, policies that would add at least another $50 trillion to the budget.
When you're dealing with the future of the planet, I don't know how you go too far.
These are not radical extremist ideas. I am not coming before the American people and say, look, I am this radical, wild-eyed socialist, crazy ideas, but listen to me, you know.
You have more and more growth, producing products that we do not necessarily need. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you don't necessarily need a choice of 23 underarm spray deodorants or 18 different pairs of sneakers when children are hungry in this country.
It's all in keeping with his decades-long pattern of ignoring the downsides of centralizing authority and massively increasing the size of the government.
Massive investments, massive investments, massive investments, massive investments. My vision is not just making modest changes around the edge. It is transforming American society. So when I use the word socialist, and I know some people are uncomfortable about it, I say that it is imperative that we create a political revolution, and I hope you will be part of that movement, because if you are, we can in fact transform this country.
So as American voters consider whether to sign up for part 2 of Sanders' political revolution, they should consider whether this time it really will be different.
They really were talking about a transformation of society. Healthcare in Nicaragua is not free. It is terrible. It is very primitive compared to what we get, but they now have it free.